Okay.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak in this global lecture series at Tokyo Metropolitan University. My topic for today is ethical capitalism, how to recouple moral and economic surplus value production. My talk has three parts. First, I will talk about the nature of capitalism. That is, I will first address the question, what is capitalism, and why do people, for good or bad reasons, believe that capitalism is responsible for the manifold nested polycrises that we're currently witnessing on planet Earth? In the second part, I will answer the question, what is ethics? That is, what is moral thinking about? Which will then lead me to my third and final, most important part of how to bridge both ethics and therefore moral and human progress and capitalist surplus value production. That is, I will try to offer a solution space for the various crises that we're currently part of, based on the best achievements of modernity. That is going to be the program for today. So let's get started. Part one, what is capitalism? So when we hear the term capitalism, we typically hear something along the lines of the critiques of capitalism. So the term capitalism enters jargon and debates in the 19th century, in particular in the wake of Karl Marx's famous critique of capitalism in his big book, The Capital, and elsewhere. So we are used to thinking of capitalism as always something that is somehow in crisis, problematic, and dealing with exploitation and other forms of socioeconomic inequalities, for instance. But on closer inspection, this famous Marxist line of thinking about capitalism breaks down, and instead, we need to rethink the nature of capitalism from the get-go. This is what I'm going to do in the first part of my talk. So let's first look at the definition of capitalism. What does this term even mean? And if you explore the economic literature on capitalism, handbooks and papers, etc., then you will find that capitalism typically can be defined in terms of three conditions for this type of economic system. The first condition is private ownership of the means of production. This idea goes as far back as Karl Marx in particular. So the idea is this: if someone runs a company, paradigmatically in modernity, a type of factory or any other form of corporation, then the owners of the company, however defined, own the means of production of the goods that the company produces in order to achieve profit, that is surplus value. So the factory owner owns the machines in the factory, Facebook owns the data, say, right? Or the servers on which data are stored, or some other type of infrastructure without which it could not achieve its products. And this ownership is not in the hands of either the democratic people or absolutely everybody, or in the hands of what we call the state. So private here means not socialized, that is not everybody's property, nor does it mean the state's property. So that's the very idea of a private ownership of the means of production. That's the first condition on capitalism. And the classical so-called capitalist then is defined as the owner of such means of production. So Mark Zuckerberg would be a paradigmatic capitalist, for instance, whereas by that definition, the Japanese state or the German state could not be capitalist, because if the state owns something, then it's not owned by private people. That would be already a limitation, as you can see, to this definition of capitalism. But that's the first condition, private ownership of the means of production. The second condition is freedom of contract, and therefore associated labor law. Freedom of contract means that you can negotiate your contract with any company in any way that you like. under legal and moral fundamental conditions, to be sure, but your wage, your working hours, the specific tasks that you're fulfilling for the company, and the rights and duties that you thereby shape between you and the company, what you owe to each other, the one, the labor force, and the other, the payment, say, right? Or a vendor who sells parts of a machine to a company and gets a certain payment in return. Those conditions can be freely negotiated, where free means no specific intervention by a third higher party, such as, again, the state or the people, the democratically powerful people. Nobody negotiates my contracts for me. Freedom of contract. The third condition on capitalism is free markets, a hotly debated topic these days. So freedom of market means, again, no third party interferes with the negotiation on a market. That is, goods can be traded in terms of interests of exchange, and these interests of exchange and the conditions of exchange are not subject to a higher form of control. Again, paradigmatically, the state. If on the Japanese car market, BMW enters a competition with Toyota for certain cars, then it is not the case that the state interferes, at least not heavily, apart from certain conditions that, again, are legally set, that are part of trade tariffs and international law, but the state doesn't go in and negotiate the specific conditions for the market by saying, for instance, only 5,000 cars can be sold this year, right? So in general, the presence of free markets, though limited in any actual real market economy, the freedom of market, again, is constitutive of capitalism. So let me summarize the three conditions. Condition one, private ownership of the means of production. Condition two, freedom of contract. And condition three, freedom of markets or presence of free markets. Those three conditions are what economists typically understand by capitalism. Nothing more and nothing less. Now, many people, in particular critics of capitalism, assume that capitalism is responsible for many crises. Capitalism, so the analysis goes, typically triggers financial crises, such as the famous 2008 financial crisis or the Great Depression in the early 20th century. It triggers, in addition to those crises, geopolitical crises, because it is, so say the critics, constitutively involved in imperial forms of exploitation. Then capitalism is said to trigger inequality, because it makes it possible, or to a certain extent even easy, for the capitalist to accumulate incredible amounts of wealth, which then make the capitalist always richer and richer, and therefore accumulate power in the hands of few, which can then subjugate the masses. This would then lead to incredible amounts of exploitation in the workforce, and more recently to shortcomings in democracy. Just think of the rise of plutocracy in the United States of America, not to mention Russia, where this is obviously a serious problem. So plutocracy leads to the destruction of democracy, leads to incredible amounts and unacceptable amounts of inequality. And lastly, but not least, a famous critique, for instance, advanced vocally and with interesting new arguments, prominently by Kohei Saito in Japan, but many people argue along those lines these days. The third big problem caused by capitalism, according to that critique, is the ecological disaster, the various ecological crises that we're witnessing. Given that there's freedom of markets, globalized markets lead to the destruction of the planet, because it's always cheaper to produce elsewhere, to outsource, for instance, labor force, and then produce one part of a car in Thailand, which goes through Malaysia, through China, in whatever way, until that part reaches a factory somewhere, say in Bavaria. And that distribution of labor and that division of powers leads necessarily, says the critic, to the destruction of the planet. Now add the claim that capitalism by its nature harbors greed, as the famous philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once said, money is like seawater. The more you drink of it, the thirstier you get, right? So if that is true, right, if greed is a necessary ingredient to the surplus value production conditions of capitalism, then you see that the current crises we are in, paradigmatically the gigantic ecological disaster, but also the geopolitical crises at the end of the day are nothing but signifiers of capitalism, as it were, right? They all show us that capitalism is the big problem. So this critique is advanced by many radical leftist thinkers. For instance, most recently, the philosopher and social critic Nancy Fraser, in her book Cannibal Capitalism, argues that capitalism has a cannibalist tendency. It consumes everything and absolutely everybody under the imperative of its greed. That's the fundamental idea. Now, in order to see what's wrong with this generalization from the three conditions that I mentioned, private ownership of the means of production, freedom of markets, freedom of contract, right? You cannot generalize, I will now argue, from those loose conditions of capitalism to such big claims. And in order to see what's wrong with this line of thinking and to repair capitalism, rather than to revolutionize our system or even to reform it, just to repair what's wrong, in order to get there, we need to see first what the actual contrast is to capitalism. So the actual contrast to capitalism, in my view, is precisely not socialism or communism. So any capitalist system that actually exists, from the United States via European Union capitalist systems to Japan, any actually existing capitalist economic system has social conditions that restrict greed, inequality, and other impacts of free markets by way of the law, which is already socially owned by absolutely everybody. The law, under conditions of the democratic rule of law, that is under conditions of what the journalist Martin Wolfs calls democratic capitalism, the law already constrains what can be on markets. It generates moral limits of the market, as was pointed out by philosophers Michael Sandel, Deborah Setz, and others, who point out that the law is socially owned, and therefore there's some type of social contract under any capitalist conditions that limits what is available on markets. Whereas, for instance, in officially communist conditions, such as those in China, it is easier, for instance, to get organs on markets, via markets, interestingly, precisely because we do not have this type of interaction between the socially owned, morally progressive law and its implementation in free markets. So that is a specificity, as a matter of fact, of democratic capitalism. More on that in the third part on ethical capitalism. So the contrast is not going to be great communism or wonderful socialism. Socialist or social elements are present in any form of capitalism, even in the United States of America, where you have a health system of sorts, you have a state-owned infrastructure, and you have a very strong rule of law. So there too, you will see that democracy and capitalism are in some kind of balance and balance each other's tendencies out. So this will be present in every actually existing capitalist society, an element of socialism. So the real contrast then is not communism or socialism, but feudalism. So even Karl Marx accepted that capitalism is a necessary force in the transition to what he thought of as a freer, more humane society. For him, that's the term communism designates that society. And capitalism destroys and destroyed, historically speaking, feudalism. So a system of warlords repressing people and owning people's labor without any chance of freedom of contract is certainly worse than capitalism, if by capitalism we only understand the three conditions that I laid out at the beginning of this part of my talk. So the relevant contrast for capitalism should be feudalism, not socialism, because capitalism, as we know it, incorporates elements of socialism and can always tune them up, as we will see. Nor is the contrast communism, because we do not even quite know what communism is on closer inspection, apart from the idea of a utopia where all economic problems are solved. But there's no such utopia, as we can see, and by definition, there cannot be a utopia. So the question is always going to be, what is a realistic solution space for the crises that we're in? And communism is not one of those, because it's just a name for a solution without any specific, realistically implementable recommendations. So much for the very definition of capitalism. So again, just to sum up, private ownership of means of production, freedom of markets, freedom of contract, and the opposition to capitalism is not communism, because that doesn't exist, nor is it socialism, which is incorporated in capitalism as we know it in the shape of democratic capitalism. The actual contrast is feudalism, and feudalism is, I think, arguably bad if we want to solve the ecological crisis or financial crises by way of feudalism. If this were the only way out, then we should rather have the ecological crisis, I would argue. So let's come to part 2, which is a driver of the critique of capitalism to the extent to which such a critique is justified. Part 2, ethics. Ethics, in general, is a subdiscipline of philosophy. Philosophy is a scientific discipline like physics and economics, biology, chemistry, or Japanese culture studies. Philosophy, in general, is about thinking about thinking. Philosophers think about thinking itself and develop models of thinking in general. Models of thinking in general are then studied in logics, which historically speaking has led to advanced mathematics, advanced computer science, and many achievements and shortcomings of modernity in the technological realm. This is all the outcome of logical thinking about thinking. That is the core activity of philosophy. But philosophy has other dimensions. It thinks about the human mind, about what it is to be conscious, to be someone, a self, if we even have one. Buddhists believe we don't have a self, and some other theorists believe that we do have a self. So that is philosophy of mind. And there are other subdisciplines of philosophy. Now, ethics is a subdiscipline of philosophy which deals with the nature, scope, and existence of moral facts. So let me first define my terms and then do a little ethics, which leads to ethical capitalism as the concluding most heavy-duty work of today's lecture. So a fact in general is a true thought, as the logician and mathematician Gottlob Frege has put it at the beginning of the 20th century. The idea can be summarized in an easier way. So let a fact simply be a true answer to a meaningfully posed question. So right now I'm in Bonn, Germany, recording this lecture for my audience, mostly in Japan. So now the question is, where am I, right? It's a meaningfully posed question. In which city am I currently located as I utter these sentences? And the answer to the question is Bonn, Germany. So I'm in Bonn, Germany. And me being in Bonn, Germany is therefore a fact. It's a true answer to a meaningfully posed question. So what is 2 plus 2 if we want to add it up to one number? Well, the answer is 4. So the meaningfully posed question, what do 2 and 2 add up to in terms of a single number, is the number 4. So again, the fact is 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's a mathematical fact. So now we had examples of geographical facts, me being in Bonn, or Bonn being in Germany, a more general fact. And then we had the mathematical fact, 2 plus 2 equals 4. There are many, many other facts. For instance, there are legal facts. Legal facts according to which it's possible for Japan to both have a tenno and ministers. So you have a particular political system. And the political system is specified in terms of legal facts. Now, many facts can change. Japan could have another legal system, and I'm not necessarily in Bonn. I could be in Tokyo. I could just fly over, and then I am in Tokyo. Whereas some other facts, such as 2 + 2 = 4, cannot change. So some facts change, other facts do not change. But in general, facts are, again, true answers to meaningfully posed questions. Now let's come to moral facts. What is a moral fact? A moral fact is a true answer to a meaningfully posed question concerning morality. So now I need to define morality in order for us to understand what moral facts are, if they exist. And I will give you reasons why people think they do not exist, and then argue against them and demonstrate that there are moral facts which are important for our economy, which is going to be the biggest claim of today's talk. So morality then. Morality is about, to use the phrase of a famous moral philosopher at Harvard, Thomas Scanlon, morality is about what we owe to each other. And I mean this quite specifically, more specifically than Thomas Scanlon. And in order to see what I have in mind, let's look at my favorite example, which is very easy to understand, on the basis of which we can then generalize. Imagine you see a child drowning in very shallow water. So there's very shallow water, and the child is in danger. A very small child just crawled into that water, and you're in no way handicapped not to save that child, right? So you're not in a wheelchair, you would know how to swim, you can just walk there, you see the child, there's no risk in any way to your life or to anything, right? So you can save the child. Or you can drink a beer. You're really thirsty and the beer gets warm if you don't run to the beer. Now, the question is, faced with a choice, beer or saving the child, what you have to do. And the answer should hopefully be clear to the entire audience of this talk. You have to save the child. And the fact that you have to save the child now is a moral fact, because it is something that you owe to the child regardless of who you are. So as soon as the condition is met that you can save the child, right, because you run no own risk, right, you face no complicated dilemma between saving this one child and saving 500 other children, etc., right? So all it takes is, pick up that child from shallow water, or drink the beer, then it's very clear what you ought to do under any other circumstances, right? So if the circumstance is given, you can save the child seems to be drowning, and there's the beer, then you ought to save the child. That is a moral fact. And regardless of who the child is, and regardless of who you are, you have to save the child. So even if you had a time machine, right, and the child is Vladimir Putin, you still have to save the child. That's the point. And if Vladimir Putin is the person who can save the child, and the child is his mortal enemy, then still, for moral reasons, Vladimir Putin has to save the child. That's the point of a moral fact. A moral fact, in one word, is unconditionally binding. So once the conditions for your capacity to execute the action are met, so you can save the child, you therefore ought to save the child. That's a moral fact. Now, moral facts are addressed to humans because humans are capable of understanding moral facts. We have moral awareness of reality. This, as far as we know, does not hold throughout the animal kingdom. Imagine the child is drowning and a lion walks up to the situation and drinks the water instead of saving the human child. Then we would not say that the lion is evil or that the lion made a moral mistake. We would just say that the lion drank the water, unfortunately, and didn't even consider saving the child. The lion doesn't understand the situation as one where moral questions even arise. So while a lion might save her own child, right, for pro-social biological reasons, which are perfectly fine, that is the origin of morality, but not full morality yet, while this is the case, we wouldn't blame a lion for not saving the child. By contrast, we would blame a human for not saving a lion child. So same situation, a baby lion is drowning and there's the beer, then I still have to save the lion child. So the fact that morality is grounded in human perception of morality does not mean that we only owe something to humans. Animal ethics, environmental ethics, and so forth flow from human commitment. We are responsible for the environment and for the biodiversity, etc., in ways in which no other known animal is responsible for their environment and for other species. This is just a consequence of our cognitive moral powers. Just like we are much better at physics than lions, right? We are much better at ethics than lions. And that is not talking bad about lions, just a fact about humans as compared to lions. It might be the case that there are superior beings who are better at understanding the commands of morality, but we have not seen them yet, right? Unless you believe in gods and spirits, etc., right? Which would be a different talk. So, but let's talk about human ethics for today. And human ethics, again, is about moral facts. And moral facts are something that we owe to each other. And now let me add this important phrase: in virtue of our shared humanity. I owe something to the child in virtue of our shared humanity. And I owe something to the lion in virtue of my recognition of the lion's similarity to our life form. So some would now object at this point that this is speciesism, as a famous saying goes, as if I was privileging humans. I'm not. As I just said, we owe something to the lion, right? So the fact that humans are privileged perceivers of moral facts does not lead to any form of moral arrogance. However, having said that, if I had to kill 1,000 lions to save one human child, I would kill the lions. And I think this would be a moral fact, right? So that is a contentious claim. But you see, I do believe that moral facts are grounded in humanity, and that can be debated. And any such debate would be a debate in ethics as I introduced it. Now, ethics, as I introduced it, the discipline dealing with the nature, scope, and existence of moral facts, is not a closed final discipline. It is a scientific discipline. Just as physics is not as its end, you can still discover things in physics, so ethics has not yet come to its completion. We can discover lots of things in ethics. For instance, we never figured it quite out what the best ethics for solving the COVID pandemic would have been. We tried very hard. Every nation state in particular, responsible politicians, people in the health sector, individuals and collective, tried their best to figure this out, right? Should I go and see my grandmother? In which ways should I support my neighbors? Should schools be closed and restaurants? All those debates, right, that we have been having. And our behavior were ethical debates, but we didn't figure out the perfect solution, right? So we tried very hard, and we certainly failed in many respects. Nobody found the perfect solution, which would have been the ethical solution, but we tried. We all engaged in ethical reasoning for many years during the pandemic, and now similarly for the other geopolitical crises, which are all heavy-laden ethical questions. You know, think of the ecological crisis, to which we do not yet have a final answer. So the fact that there are moral facts does not mean that I or any other ethicist knows all those moral facts. On the contrary, it means precisely that there's a possibility of figuring out what the moral facts are, because there are moral facts. So let me conclude this section with a brief, run through the major counterforce against the view that I have just laid out. The major counterforce is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism believes that there is no single set or any complex web of moral facts out there to be detected by humans because they are specifically addressed at humans, but rather that each culture constructs its own supreme values such that those supreme values constructed by a given culture are their ethical code. If this were correct, then we could imagine, for instance, the German Nazi society or the contemporary Russian society as not engaged in aggressive wars, but just having a different ethics. So Putin would not be evil in shooting Iskander rockets at kindergartens in Kiev. He would just be different. He would just belong to a different society. Reason enough maybe to combat him, but we would not condemn him. Okay, so we couldn't condemn his actions as evil. We could only say, well, he's just a little different, right? And then we would have Western values, which maybe condemn shooting of Iskander rockets at civilians, and Russian values, for which this would be absolutely no problem. So this would not be a real conflict, right? No ethical conflict, but just a conflict between war parties. It would just be a struggle for survival of whose values survive the as it were, biological drift. This, by the way, was Hitler's conception of ethics, or I would say ethics, because I do not even think that this is an ethical conception. The idea of just a struggle of cultures for survival, and then we would measure ethical codes only in terms of maybe survival skills or, who wins the war. I think that is utterly misguided because it doesn't capture the fact that there are universal moral facts that hold across cultures. So no culture is minimally interested in throwing all babies out of the window just for fun or in torturing minors, right, just because they like it. So all cultures agree, and there's ample empirical evidence that this is true, on certain fundamental, universally valid facts of a moral nature, and therefore each culture recognizes the very existence of universal ethical codes, which undermines this idea of cultural relativism. There are even more arguments against it, with which I will not bother you, but for those who are interested in wonderfully laid out, careful refutations of cultural relativism, I recommend work by the philosopher Paul Boghossian, in particular his book, Fear of Knowledge. And later work, let me just give you one more argument, and then we come to the core of today's lecture, bringing ethics and capitalism together. But one more argument is, I think, a useful toolbox for everybody to overcome our tendency towards cultural relativism. Here goes. So imagine we think about the Taliban's practice of not letting, female children go to school, right? So they discriminate in their education system against females heavily for whatever reasons they cite. Now, could we want to say that they just have a different ethical code, right? I want my daughters to go to school. That's my ethical code. They don't want their daughters to go to school. That's their ethical code. Now, that would mean that we have the following two claims. According to the Taliban, don't let your daughters go to school. According to the Westerners, let your daughters go to school. Now, those two claims, the according to the Taliban and the according to the Westerner claim, those two claims are not ethical claims, they are sociological claims. They're just claims about what people believe. Westerners, including Japan, etc., Westerners or Democrats believe, liberal Democrats believe that their kids, all of their kids should get an education. Taliban do not believe this, but that's not an ethical fact. That's just a fact about what people believe. So in order to capture an ethical fact, you have to formulate it as an odd claim. Daughters, everybody, trans people, etc., everybody ought to go to school, whereas the others say not everybody ought to go to school. And those two claims are competing. Yeah? So either this claim or the other claim. You cannot have both, right? They amount to a contradiction. Therefore, if there's ethics at all, cultural relativism is false. Therefore, concluding, cultural relativism is not even a claim in ethics. It's the claim that there is no ethics, and that is just an unacceptable, wild claim, like the claim that there's no mathematics, which is also a very wildly implausible claim, because 2 + 2 = 4. Now I come to the third part of my lecture, ethical capitalism. So let me start with a bunch of moral facts about the economic system that I think hold actually true and that fuel capitalism's critics or criticisms. So, for instance, brutal inequality that leads to exploitation and basically infinite accumulation of wealth in the hand of few is morally impermissible, can be even evil, because it violates a fundamental principle of the justification of capitalism, the so-called difference principle, famously introduced by the liberal philosopher John Rawls. The difference principle, a little simplified, states that inequality is only justified to the extent to which it leads to the fact that the worst off in a society are better off in virtue of the best off being better off. In short, right, if inequality rises, but the poor rise up, right? So, and we can even alleviate people from poverty, like modern capitalist societies have been doing over the last 200 years. So if we can eradicate, maybe ideally even poverty, by some people being incredibly rich, then this would justify, right, such a system of inequality. So this very simple thought just illustrates that inequality per se cannot be the problem. The problem is inequality, right, such that one group accumulates wealth and the other group goes down, right? So if this is the case, then this is an immoral aspect of capitalism, and that needs to be limited by way of regulations, for instance, by way of moral thinking, by way of protest, demonstrations, etc., by all ways that are accessible within the framework of the democratic rule of law. And we have all sorts of means to reduce this amount of inequality, pernicious inequality that we find in many countries. So Japan is doing still very well on that front, which is part of why it's such a capitalist society or country, sorry, or system for that matter. In Japan, you still have an acceptable shape of inequality, which is not to say that there are no problems with inequality in Japan, because inequality runs along different lines, gender, etc., etc. But what I'm saying is this: inequality per se is not the problem. Only bad inequality is the problem. And bad inequality is inequality that violates the difference principle, according to which the justification of inequality is the fact that the richest make the poorer richer. That's the difference principle. So, and if this is systemic, then you have a good economic system. Yeah? That's the first ethical claim. But it's an ethical claim concerning capitalism and not a claim merely made within capitalism. Yeah? But we'll get to that, how to combine, to couple capitalism and moral claims. So that's the first one. The second big claim is, of course, that we need to stop, to the extent to which this is still possible, the ecological disaster that we're all witnessing, the slow death of, biodiversity, global warming, etc., etc., all sorts of environmental damage, pollution of rivers, etc. We all know what I'm talking about, and that cannot go on, right? And nothing in the of the shape that we see right now is justified, and that is a moral claim within ecology. And I think that claim that many green movements are making right now, and not just green movements, is a fully legitimate, totally correct, ethical claim that captures a moral fact. So anything in our capitalist system that aggravates the ecological disaster is something that needs to be repaired, fixed, or even replaced by some other module in terms of laws, regulations, economic stimulation systems, etc., etc., accounting for externalities. We have all sorts of tools of dealing with the problem. But what I'm saying is it's a moral fact that we ought to deal with that problem, and not just an economic fact or any other fact. It's a moral fact that we ought to do something, right? So again, here, the critics of capitalism rightly rely on a moral fact. So we need morality in order to criticize shortcomings within capitalism, but we do not need to supersede capitalism as Karl Marx thought, because Karl Marx also criticized ethics. He thought that ethics is always just an ideological justification of the status quo. So he thought for that reason that communist society would come into existence in somewhat historical mechanical terms, and not by way of ethical claims, such as the ones that I'm advancing in this third part. So how can we then generally bring together ethics and capitalism, right? Remember how I defined capitalism, and then what I said about ethics as being the philosophical subdiscipline which studies the nature, scope, and existence of moral facts. So how can we bring the two together, apart from the moral claims that are just made concerning the economy? I would include, obviously, such things as there shouldn't be any slavery, exploitation is bad of labor, right? Of workers. We should have good labor laws, etc., right? I could go on and on and on about moral facts that should constrain behavior within markets. Many things should not be for sale, such as organs and children, etc., right? And then one can have many complicated ethical debates about pornography and and other forms of sexual encounters between humans. To which extent should they be part of markets or not, right? There are legitimate debates to be had about the limits of markets, but all of this again takes place within capitalist economy. So let's get to how to bring ethics and capitalism together in one unified concept, which I call ethical capitalism. So ethical capitalism starts in the way in which I'm currently propounding it, with reference to three more or less, or let's say four, let's add the fourth one, more or less contemporary thinkers in a historical row. It will be Adam Smith. I will say a few words about why I bring Adam Smith in here. Then the second figure would be Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian, German, then American economist. I'm sitting here in Bonn, where he was also a professor of economics, and I'm around the Joseph Schumpeter street. So let me say something about this person who had a very deep insight that will be useful for us. And then I will come to two contemporary theorists of capitalism, the economists John Kay and Colin Mayer. Right, and I've already mentioned Deborah Setz, limits of markets theorist, in earlier parts of my talk, but now I will go to the economic core of my argument. So Adam Smith. In my reading, Adam Smith's famous invisible hand is not the claim that markets solve ethical problems or problems just by being markets. The invisible hand is not the surprising effect of markets that markets solve problems. The invisible hand, in my reading, is what Adam Smith, in his other famous book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, called the moral sentiments. So the invisible hand is the fact that humans in markets still behave like humans. That is, they bring their ethical interest to the table. So it is not the case that the butcher and the baker, right, try to steal your money, as it were, when you go there and buy your meat or your bread, right? That's not, or the supermarket tries to steal your money when you buy your rice. That's not the situation. The supermarket tries to sell you rice at an acceptable price, and the supermarket needs to behave in a minimally moral way in order to still have clients. So market behavior is constrained by human interests, and humans are fundamentally interested in morally acceptable conditions of exchange. For this reason, there's an ethical driver in markets such that there's a tendency in markets to do morally good. There's an equal tendency for markets to ruin human behavior. So I'm not saying all markets are good or it's in the nature of markets to be good. What I'm saying is that it's in the nature of markets that humans, and therefore animals capable of perceiving moral facts, are involved in the type of exchange that's definitive, constitutive of markets. So that's the Adam Smith reading. We are moral agents even in market exchange. Nobody is typically that evil, right? So capitalist society, due to freedom of markets, right, leads to moral competition, right? Where do you want to shop? The company that treats you well, or the company that misuses you or treats you poorly, right? This obvious question leads to minimal insight into the fact that we are moral agents in free markets, which is not the case, for instance, in actual communist societies, which fare much better with, much worse, sorry, with their markets due to the controlling force. If the controlling force is evil, then the control of markets will be evil, right? So markets with freedom, where some agents do good and some agents do evil, right, have a higher probability of being stable contributors to moral progress. That's an old argument for democracy and capitalism that you find in 18th century Enlightenment thinkers, such as the famous thinker, French thinker Condorcet, who argues along those lines as well. So it's a typical 18th century Adam Smith, Condorcet, etc. idea. Now, to Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter, in his famous book on democracy, capitalism, and socialism, asks the famous question whether capitalism has a future, and he answers no, surprisingly. By this, he does not mean that socialism will win or that communism will automatically come into existence. What he means is that there is no single system of capitalism. Schumpeter thinks of capitalism famously in terms of creative destruction. Here, creative destruction does not mean that capitalism destroys absolutely everything, the environment, markets, freedom, democracy, etc. What he meant was that there's constant technological, economic, scientific progress within capitalist societies such that they do not form a system. So there is then, to be precise, no capitalist society at the end of the day, but only these loose conditions with which I started my talk, and the rest is roughly free negotiation whose contours cannot be anticipated. In short, according to Schumpeter, capitalism is more like water than like steel, and that is why he says it doesn't have a future, because it cannot be predicted, right? It's a shapeless, anarchical activity of constant innovation. That's his idea. And now, similarly, coming to those two present thinkers that I mentioned, John Kay and Colin Mayer, we can think of capitalism as an assemblage of problem-solving tools. So I have a problem, say I want a sip of coffee. So in order to drink a sip of coffee, someone has to produce the coffee, someone has to produce the cup, etc., and the coffee machine. So my problem is I want coffee, can be solved by capitalist means. And in this way, someone, those who produce the cup, those who produce the coffee, etc., make some kind of profit from me sipping from this coffee now. And similarly, we can think of all companies as capacities or skills of problem solving. So what they offer is problem solutions. That's a fundamental idea that John Kay has been advancing. And then again, you see that capitalism does not form a system, right? Maybe even a system of oppression, domination, imperialist exploitation, etc., right? It's just not a system. It's just a loosely connected set of free activities designed to solve human problems. If that's the nature of capitalism, then you see why it's so powerful. Again, just like water, it's incredibly malleable and corresponds to a deep feature of humanity, namely human freedom. And human freedom is always going to be the freedom to do good or evil as well, because again, we are perceivers of moral facts. Now let's move from John Kay and Schumpeter's idea of capitalism as not a system, as anarchical and free and innovative, to an idea recently advanced by Colin Mayer, which will then lead to my concluding reflections. So Colin Mayer, in a wonderful forthcoming book called Capitalism and Crises, How to Fix Them, argues that we need a notion of what he calls true profit. True profit, as opposed to mere profit, is subject to what he calls the moral law. And the moral law is the imperative to help each other help each other. That's roughly his formulation. So if we think of capitalism as, again, the production of conditions of mutual aid rather than exploitation, right? If this is what's going on, cooperation, not subjugation and exploitation or mere competition. So if we advance a model of cooperative society rather than competitive society as a ground for capitalist activity, then we can shape this notion of a true profit. So a true profit would be profit that is gained in terms of solving a major problem. For instance, solving the climate problem. So anybody who can solve the energy problem by way of nuclear fusion or whatever it would be, I don't know, of course, otherwise I would be that person. So if anybody could solve that problem, they would, of course, be incredibly wealthy, and for good reasons, because they would have catered to absolutely everybody's interest on planet Earth. Similarly, during the pandemic, pharmaceutical companies made a lot of money, and let me add, rightly so. I'm not a critic of it. I'm glad that we had such a wonderful choice between vaccines, which were produced rather rapidly as a response to an all too dangerous pandemic. Now, people should always have had the choice at the end of the day between taking a vaccine or not, but I can tell you, I'm very happy to live in a democratic rule of law, which was capable of producing a wide array of vaccine and distributing them to their population as a consequence precisely of free markets, freedom of contract, and the private ownership of means of production. The state could not have produced better vaccines than those companies produced under capitalist conditions. So it's probably not a coincidence that the most effective vaccines came from capitalist, democratic, rule of law societies. That's not a coincidence, I would argue. Yeah, so again, here we have a huge problem-solving capacity in free markets, and we praise it because it has such ethically favorable results, such as the production and distribution of vaccines, which again, some people would not want to take for whatever reason, but I was happy to have access to that funky contemporary scientific technology. mRNA, for instance, I happily took 4 of those, right? But again, that can be disputed, but I wanted those vaccines, and it's great that we had them. It certainly contributed to a better solution to the pandemic than any other solution that was accessible to us. So true profit then is profiting from doing the morally good thing. That would be the concept of true profit. So let me then conclude this lecture with my reflections on how to recouple, to use the language of the economist Dennis Noah, how to recouple moral progress and economic progress. So in general, what went wrong, arguably, in modernity is its exclusive focus on industrialization. So the problem that I think the critics of capitalism rightly have in view was not capitalism, it was industrial capitalism. So the problem is not, as I said, this loose anarchical structure of freedom of markets, private ownership of the means of production, and freedom of contract. That's not the problem. The problem was industrialization, rapid industrialization, and therefore the loose canon of mere techno-scientific progress coupled with economic progress that was not subjected to any kind of ethical scrutiny at the time. I mean, quite rapidly, of course, there were protests against, the shortcomings of this first wave of industrialization, which we saw in particular in England in the late 18th and then early 19th century, which a model which spread out over the entire planet in different waves, right? We saw these shortcomings, child labor, indeed, pollution, the air in London was not great during the first waves of the industrialization, to say the least, right? So we saw all of that, but this is a consequence of first waves of industrialization and not of capitalism. And what went wrong was the absence of an ethical, philosophical, humanistic understanding of how we should relate to each other. So while even, of course, industrial capitalism generated much progress at the end of the day, right? While this is still the case, we need to see to it that in the future, all sorts of technoscientific progress, just to mention the obvious example, artificial intelligence and other forms of socially disruptive technology, should not only be accompanied by philosophical, ethical reflection, but deeply guided by ethical design. So in light of this idea, I propose a new enlightenment. The new enlightenment is a serious interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary enterprise which brings together all academic disciplines and practitioners from other sectors of society, politics, business, etc., in order to bring economic progress and ethical progress together to fuse them into a single line of human progress. Now, human progress in the new enlightenment can, of course, only be achieved if we understand cultural difference. Of course, there are very interesting cultural differences between my social space, right, and what we can very superficially call Japanese culture. There are, of course, many Japanese cultures, to be precise, but, you know, just think of the language and think of Japan as a unified language space, which is roughly correct. And then the kinds of things that you do with Japanese language, including all the social relations in which Japanese language is involved, differ significantly from what I do with German language in my everyday life in Germany. So in that sense, there are, of course, different cultures. And we need to understand those different cultures, not in terms of different ethical codes, but in terms of different expressions of our shared humanity. So humanity realizes itself in different shapes and forms. Humanity is diverse by its very nature and multi-perspectival. There are different perspectives on what is the case and what we ought to do. And in order to figure the ethical facts out, the moral facts out, we need to cooperate across disciplines, across cultures, and across sectors, not with the idea of having a dominant mode of thinking, right? I'm not for a central governmental ethics control system of any type. What I'm saying rather is that ethical thinking should be embedded within capitalist society. For this reason, I'm proposing that all companies should introduce the function of a CPO, a chief philosophy officer, someone who runs an ethics and general deep epistemology philosophy training camp, right, for all employees, and a group which then also observes the company's business model, its internal culture, etc., not with the goal of restricting or constraining economic activity, but on the contrary, right, with the goal of developing new modes of achieving true profit, sustainable true profit in an ethical capitalist system that we have not yet seen. It was a promise of the 18th century embodied by such thinkers as Adam Smith, and it's making its return into the contemporary debate under the heading of a new moral political economy, as Federica Carugati and Margaret Levi have called this in a beautiful paper on this topic. So we are returning to this moment of modernity under entirely novel conditions. But in order to realize this time, in order to circumvent the dialectics of enlightenment that indeed led to forms of exploitation, destruction of the planet, imperialism, world wars, and many, many other shortcomings, in order to avoid this time and to really do better, I have argued today that we need to fuse insight into moral human progress with insight into the economy of surplus value production under capitalist conditions. So if such a cooperation, deep integration of different forms of knowledge across sectors and across societies is possible, then I think we can arguably solve the problems that humanity is facing right now. At least, I would claim, this is the best and maybe last shot that we have. So I hope that my recommendation, my call for new enlightenment will be heard, this time mostly by my fellow humans in Japan. Thank you very much to Tokyo Metropolitan University for having me again, this time in this distinguished lecture series. It's been a pleasure and honor to present my ideas on ethical capitalism today to you. Thank you very much.